Hello, everyone, and welcome to Dynamics of a Podcast, the only podcast dedicated to Professor James Moriarty, Napoleon of Crime and arch nemesis of Sherlock Holmes. Something that I forgot to mention last episode is that we are now actually on our third season. And technically, we're only 4 months away from our 2 year anniversary anyway. So third season, woohoo! I'm Madeline Quinones, and I am joined by my lovely, ever patient co host,
Dixie Parkinson.
And very excited about today's episode because we have with us somebody we've been trying to get on for a long time, and he is the guy who wrote our theme music for us, Josh Harvey. So I'm very excited about that. With any luck, you may have noticed, hopefully, if things worked out in the future, that this is audio only, and hopefully that you might be listening to us on iTunes or Spotify or something like that, because hopefully we have expanded past YouTube by now by the time you're listening. We should also be having a Patreon set up in the near future. And I should add that if you want to not only support us through Patreon, but perhaps sponsor us, that would be greatly appreciated. We can do a little commercial here at the beginning. But, there's a lot of costs here. The Zoom Pro account, website hosting, podcast hosting, and website. Oh my gosh. We have a proper domain now. We are still being hosted through WordPress, but we are now dynamicsofapodcast.com. So that's very exciting.
Yeah, we're moving up. And I just got a new microphone as well, so hopefully I sound a little better.
I think that you sound great. It's very exciting. So that's all the administrative stuff out of the way. And I apologize for my voice. This is not the first time that we've recorded with like one of us recovering from a cold, but oh my gosh, it's tiresome. Anyway, let's introduce our guest, Joshua Harvey. So Josh is an instructor at the Dobbins Conservatory of Theater and Dance at Southeast Missouri State University. He began his professional career in church music at the age of 15 and quickly began playing for musical theater productions from high school onwards. He received his degree in music theory and composition from Washington and Lee University in 2000 and became a lecturer, accompanist, and musical director for his alma mater's Department of Theater and Dance and Department of Music. He received his MA in the musical direction of musical theater from the Royal Conservatoire of Scotland in 2012. He has played all over the world in churches, theaters, rock, jazz, choral, gospel, symphonic, and performance art settings for weddings, funerals, bar mitzvahs, and concerts, including events in Germany, Ireland, Scotland, Canada, Cuba, Costa Rica, Norway, Haiti, and Finland. Wow. And he's married and a dad to boot. All right, Josh, welcome to the show. It's so exciting to have you here finally.
Thank you. I was going to say finally, after maybe actually months and maybe even longer than months of talking about it.
I think it's been more than a year at this point.
Yes, COVID time has taken over.
This is true. This is true. So yeah, like there's so much to talk about, and you definitely have kind of a unique Sherlockian connection that I can't think anybody else that I know of in terms of like big name Sherlockian personalities. Nobody else has this connection, which is you actually knew Patrick Gowers, the composer for the Granada Sherlock Holmes series. So as we talked about before we started recording, I know that you can't talk in depth about this, but could you just tell us a little bit?
Sure. So, I did know him briefly, for about a year, and I knew his wife as well, um, way better. Um, Before I went to grad school in Scotland, I had rediscovered, I think on YouTube, just the soundtrack for Granada,
Hmm.
and was like, this is so incredible. And there's something going on here as a musician that I wish I had this level of talent and the ability to write beautiful music that also fits, the tone of a Sherlock Holmes mystery show, that sort of thing. And it was just sort of in the back of my mind. And my wife and I got married, and 10 days later we moved to Scotland. And, that's a whole other opportunity to be closer to the the BBC people in general. And so I, at some point, they were like, you need to have an internship, for grad school. And I thought, this is really wild. I would love to get in contact with not only Patrick Gowers, but also Michael Price of BBC Sherlock. And it's so great because as students, they're so honoring of students. I literally just found email addresses for both of them. I think I went through Patrick Gower's son, Sir Timothy Gowers. I found his his website at Cambridge, knighted professor of mathematics,
Oh
and just
my
said,
gosh.
yeah, I was just like, I'd love to get in touch with your dad. I know he's had a stroke and that sort of thing. And he was very kind and said, let me get you in contact with my mom, and sent her email address, and we chatted. And she was also thinking about being in transition, as an older person living in a flat by herself. And she was like, yeah, really, all this stuff is just kind of sitting in a closet in our flat in South London. And I said, well, can I come down as an internship, in air quotes, because no one can see me on audio? Um, like, check it out, see what we can do to like preserve it. Um, and they'd gotten rid of a lot of the extraneous parts, like the all the orchestra parts and stuff. Apparently, at some point, that had just been stacked all through this big closet, and they'd gotten rid of all that stuff, but they'd kept all the conductor scores with all of the parts. And so I made an arrangement. She was very kind, to have us, my wife and I, after I graduated from grad school, to come down to London for a couple of weeks, and which was super nice because it gave us a place to stay in London for a couple of weeks before we moved back to the United States. But we basically, for the first week, just sorted through all of the sheet music of all of the scores for Granada. And they were sort of in order, like they were sort of in show order, but then there'd be a spare thing here. And so what we did was we put them all back together by queue order of the series and got them. And then when the time came to be done, we found a place, um, that the BBC Symphony actually uses to archive their like handwritten classical scores and things like that. This was 2012, so bulk scanning doesn't seem like a big deal a decade later, but in 2012 it was really hard to be like, we have 1,000 pages of music that we want to keep, and get scanned into PDF essentially. And
Mhm.
so we dropped it off, and in about 48 hours they had scanned it all. I might just imagine someone
Oh,
like
wow.
in Western London like spending all night like hand scanning every single thing in order, and they handed us a CD-ROM essentially. And so I got a copy of one, and Carolyn Gowers, his wife, got a copy of one, and it's stuff, normal file folders, so you can copy it into others. So every computer I own, whether they're alive and working or dead in my garage, have a copy of it because it's like so interesting and important. And she's moved, and I'm not really sure where the actual handwritten copies have gone. I think they've either gone to the British Museum or
Mhm.
the British Museum for like TV and film, which I'm hoping
Mhm.
will open up some other researchers to go. So that's kind of one of the internships that I had, musically, was to just sort of like go and then and they like literally sat on a CD-ROM, or I have a couple of original like big photocopies of originals, of things that aren't on the CD-ROM, and when COVID hit, I finally was able to actually go through everything and like w- rewatch all the episodes. It had been a couple years since I'd watched all the Granada episodes and was able to now I've got sort of like a rough score guide of everything that I'm trying to get together. Like eventually either it might take another 10 years just the rate that it's been going, but I'd love to like create like if you're watching Granada, here's what to listen for in this episode, so like a rough guide for every single episode, and for people that don't have to be musicians either, right? So that you
Mhm.
could be like, here, listen for this melody and have a little recording, or look for this phrase and see how it's repeated, and oh, see how this could be a clue about the solution to the end, like that sort of stuff, because he embedded like really interesting things, and I think that's one of the interesting things about the Sherlockian musics is the composers use it as an occasion to put their own meta information into what they're doing. Um, and actually, we're not friends, we're acquaintances, but actually one of the other internships that I did, which was really cool, again, just another random email. I found Michael Price's website and was like, "Hey, I'm a student. Can I come talk to you about BBC Sherlock?" Which is incredible. And so I like took a train from London to his house, and he took me to the pub across the street from his house, and he told me about like working on Lord of the Rings and like all this incredible information. um, and it was the end of season 2, and he was getting ready to start working on season 3. um, and so at some point, he looked at me and said, "Do you want to know how he did it?" And I was like, "That's so." I really wanted to know. You know what I'm saying? I really wanted to know what he thought or how he thought. Um, and maybe he was going to say they don't know, because the more people I have encountered across Sherlockiana and in conferences and things like that, that worked with the show, they're like they had no idea how he did it. They just figured they knew they would figure it out eventually.
Uh-huh.
And I was like, you know what, man, that's really kind, but I think I don't want to know, because if one person on the internet figures it out, you're gonna think that I told somebody. Like, I don't want to go viral for being the person that like accidentally spoiled BBC Sherlock. I didn't want to be responsible for that information. But it was really cool, and like he gave me some he after that sent me a couple original scores, like Sibelius files, like notation. He sent me one that's really one of the really great ones, which is the rooftop scene. He sent me the whole score
Mhm.
for Prepared to Do Anything.
Mhm.
That whole thing that wasn't computerized. Like the violin string parts and things that were played live at Abbey Road Studios. So I have that so I could like literally look at it. So it's really cool. So I've been entrusted with some original scores of two of the major, 20th century, 21st century adaptations, our lifetime or my lifetime adaptations. And so that's sort of how I got back into Sherlockiana in general. So yeah, so that's kind of the project. So that, yeah, the reason you're talking, you're very kind, about the quote unquote embargo, is that there should be an I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere um, podcast about another project I'm doing, but also Gus and Luke on the Jeremy Brett Sherlock Holmes podcast have been preparing and working on a Patrick Gowers episode. So um, that's why I'm not going to talk about it too much. But we can talk about it individual pieces as it relates to Moriarty as we get there for sure.
Yeah. But man, what an experience you've had. That's so
Yeah.
awesome.
British people are just really that nice. I don't know. I don't know. Like, I don't know other people. If I just like randomly wrote Hans Zimmer and was like, "Can I come to your studio? I happen to be in LA." I doubt. Maybe he's also very kind, but I doubt I'm going to get a response. But it was just a very cool, fortuitous occasion. And again, I do think being a student helped, because they were looking at it as this guy's coming in it from an educational angle. Um, and yeah, I mean the Granada score is thousands of pages. It's like 1,000 pages of music, and so it took me almost all of COVID to get through all of it and sort of analyze pieces of it and make my PDFs are like color coded boxes and notes, and um, I've put out a couple small videos of different cues where you can see the music. I did one for Christmas from the Blue Carbuncle, there's a great track on the soundtrack where it has all of the like a bunch of Christmas carols
Mhm,
interwoven with the main Granada theme. And I sort of
mhm.
did a little analysis video. I'm not even sure. It may be on YouTube. I don't even know where it is. It may be on Facebook someplace. Um, so I'm just kind of doing that sort of stuff.
I mean, that's so lovely. I mean, I can't read music to save my life, unfortunately. Uh, but I love soundtrack music, and I love the Granada soundtrack, and so it's very cool that you can do that. So something that I forgot about before we started talking. We've got our Moriarty questions to ask you. Dixie, would you please do
Oh,
the
yes. Oh my
honors?
gosh, what are those? I should know
Okay,
these.
okay, the first one. Who is your first Moriarty?
My first Moriarty is Porter from Granada. Eric Porter. Is that his name? That's his name, right? Eric
Yeah,
Porter?
yeah,
Yes,
Yeah,
yeah.
yes.
it's from Granada. Because I'm old enough now. I watched the original run of Granada. I remember very clearly standing on a chair in Virginia at my parents' home when I was like younger than my own children, or about the same age as my own children are now. Standing up because we're short people, and they had a little tiny TV. You know what I'm saying? Like the TV was like no bigger than my MacBook screen, or right
Right.
here.
Hmm.
It might have even been in black and white. And watching the original PBS run of at least some of, I can't tell you where I entered in because I was 7. I don't remember that.
Right.
I'm almost 45. It's almost 40 years ago.
Yeah.
So, um, but I did. I originally saw some of those, and I do remember seeing the final problem. And that was before video or DVD. You know what I'm saying? Before that, and
Hmm.
then, so I think I've held on to Granada as the sort of cornerstone of the adaptations that I've seen. I've seen a lot more since then, and again, COVID gave so much time for so many things that maybe we should have always had time to do, make time for now. But so yeah, Eric Porter would have been the first one that I saw.
That's wonderful. When like the reason that I came up with that question is because I'm just genuinely curious, especially with kind of the younger Gen X through millennials. There's this range of Moriartys through from the 80s into the 90s that
Sure.
could have been for Dixie. It was Daniel Davis. For me, it was Radigan and the Great Mouse
Sure,
Detective.
sure, sure. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And
Which
then,
I also probably did see actually as a child because I saw that specifically in the movie theater
oh,
when it came out. Yeah.
yeah. So then, yeah, you and it, with Eric Porter. So like this is like probably a common range of first exposures to Moriarty.
Yeah, it's like you're like if you're I'm like an Xennial, right? I'm the tail end of Gen X, so it has to be
Mhm,
Eric Porter probably. If you're a boomer, it's gonna be some of those guys from the couple of guys from the Basil Rathbone era,
mhm.
most likely, right? In reruns at least. And then
Or
you're
maybe John Huston from Sherlock Holmes in New York.
yeah, yeah, sure, sure, sure. Yeah, exactly. That era. And then Andrew Scott. I mean, like my wife is a millennial, so I don't think Andrew Scott was her first Moriarty, but if you ask her that question, she would probably be like, "Oh, Andrew Scott from BBC Sherlock."
Next question. Who is your favorite Moriarty?
Jared Harris.
Oh,
Hmm.
nice.
I think Jared Harris. For me, I mean, like Eric Porter is great. Like Eric Porter is great, and I love that firstly, he's like was one of the great actors of that generation.
Mhm.
Playing the greatest villain of all time, essentially, and they also really wanted to find someone that looked a little bit like the Paget drawing, and I think that's like really excellent. The thing for me about Jared Harris is I believe that he could throw another person off of off of, you know what I'm saying, of a waterfall. He's got just he is so capable in many of his roles of being intellectual and he's a physical actor at the same
Mhm.
time. Whereas like Eric Porter, sure, I can see him as an intellectual and he is foreboding. I'm not sure he, could have pushed a person off of the wall. You're right, like I guess in the life and death stakes, but I just feel like something about Jared Harris's um physicality. I'm like
Hmm.
he's scary. Like he's actually
Mhm. Yeah, he
charming
is.
and scary at the same time. And
He's
I don't know. For me,
terrifying.
yeah, he's always been my. I think he's always been my favorite. I do like Andrew Scott a lot, um, but as soon as the Game of Shadows came out, I was like, no, this is my first this is the first Moriarty that I feel like for me, um, really captures all of his personality, like his sheer genius, his charisma, but also he's scary.
Yeah, he's really cool. I don't think he gets enough appreciation as well. Okay, why do you love Moriarty? Assuming you do.
Like her love,
No, 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 I
whatever.
gotcha. Yeah, so I mean, I feel like we are living in such a especially now copyright free, but like a when I say we're living in a post Sherlock era, I mean that across the entire last 100 years. And we know that there has to be um, this sort of archetypal setup between the protagonist and the antagonist, right? The hero and the villain. Like, I think somehow that wasn't the first one, but that's still the one. If you're like, name the quintessential protagonist antagonist pair, I mean, how many people would say Sherlock and Moriarty? I think like that
Mm.
chicken and egg, two sides of the same coin um, chess match is so important and iconic to storytelling in general and post British colonial storytelling even in America. So many of our movies have that, they're but ironically there I don't think there could be Iron Man versus Thanos and I'm not that's just not a Robert Downey Jr. Right? But I feel like that is a sort of epic showdown of that same level. I feel like
Mhm.
there's something satisfactory or, Bruce Willis and oh my gosh, the other guy in Die Hard. Like
Yeah.
you've got that setup between like the flawed hero but also the brilliant villain and somehow that even with very few canonical references, right? Stories, it's somehow like ingrained into consciousness and I think having that trope is, radically interesting. And then what people have done with it has been so interesting. I haven't read all of the Moriarty pastiche books, but I've read a couple, and they're always interesting. And then your friends from Audible did such a great,
Yeah.
take, which I call, being in musical theater, I call it the Wicked take. It's the sort of retcon
Right.
interesting backstory that makes no they're really sort of an anti-hero into a hero or a villain into an anti-hero into sort of a hero of their own story but you understand the motivation or Maleficent the same sort of thing where we get to see
Hmm.
bad guys really not bad they've been victim of forces and I really enjoyed that take so I think now I hope we see more stuff I mean I think with the new I hope this comes about I don't know if I'm assuming y'all saw the announcement that there could be a new Watson TV show
Yeah.
that takes place in the Great Hiatus from the Elementary producers, and I always liked Elementary, um, and if it's Watson against Moriarty, that has its own potential, like I don't charm, and also like the stakes are going to be so different
Yeah.
Yeah.
between the partner versus the villain,
Yeah.
than the hero versus the villain. So I don't know.
Mhm.
I think almost of all the reasons to love Moriarty is like the structure that he gave us to
Mm.
that ACD gave us to appreciate a hero and a villain pair that seem like they're eternally locked in time. That's what I mean by post Sherlock, right? Like we know that if Sherlock meets Moriarty, there's going to be some version of a fall, you
Mhm.
know, and so I think that's like super important, and I think that's like I think people are gratified when that actually happens. We're like, how are they going to do it this time? Whether it's Moriarty the Patriot, which I thought was an interesting take,
Mhm.
whether it's House, that
Mhm.
the Moriarty character like literally shoots House, and like that's an interesting. Um, I no spoilers. I also like the Elementary Moriarty. Um, weird conundrum.
We've already talked about her on this show.
Sure, sure, sure. I imagine you have. I thought that was really interesting, how to fake a fall in that sort of context as well.
Mhm.
You have there's something about that, and I think probably the secondary legacy of that is unintentionally the resurrection, right? So like,
Yes.
like you're just waiting for it to happen. I mean, I thought the another Moriarty that I appreciate the Moriarty from Miss Sherlock.
Mm.
And part of the gratification is knowing that the fall, whether it's metaphorical or literal, is going to take place, and then are we going to see how he's, that great moment at the end of Miss Sherlock, and Miss Sherlock is standing right there. It's equivalent to the end of BBC Sherlock Reichenbach Fall, where we see him standing watching Watson, which is equivalent to the sort of camo urban camo thing at the end of Game of Shadows, right? Like we want to see maybe not how they did it necessarily to be explained, but we want to see somehow, um, I think, some gratification in knowing like this is how the story is. It's going to go A to B, and that's going to be C. So we've got A is Holmes versus Moriarty, B is the fall, and C is the resurrection. And
Mhm.
I'm not saying that necessarily I don't want to cast that completely into like a Christocentric sort of westernized society, but I do
But it
feel like
is pretty literally a resurrection.
yeah, and I do think we have to like take into account that that's the society that a post-colonial British society would be.
Yeah.
In America, that's what we
Mhm.
are. In Britain, that's what they're living, and
Mhm.
but I mean the sort of resurrection of the spring narrative that goes through all religions and all myths of many there are many resurrections, and many failed
Mhm.
resurrections like
Mhm.
Orpheus and Eurydice. That's a
Mhm.
resurrection story where the resurrection fails. Um,
Right.
and we expect that just as the same thing. Like that's a good
Mhm.
like we expect when we see Hades Town, we're like, well, this is gonna happen forever. And he's gonna look back and she's gonna disappear. Like we just know that that's what the story is. So I think these sort of like ingrained tropes and archetypes for storytelling are super important. And I think that's
Mhm.
why he's important. And I just think all the iterations are just so interestingly different too.
Mhm.
I think people always want to bring out really interesting. Okay, well, this Sherlock is gonna be the Robert Downey Jr. boxer type. The elementary Sherlock is gonna be the addict. He's gonna be an addict. That goes to 12-step meetings. We're gonna bring out that facet. It's like we have a picture of Sherlock, and then we pull out like attributes, and then
Mhm.
they get expanded. And I think it's fun to see what that's gonna be, and then I think it's equally fun to see how they're gonna do that with Moriarty, because the Andrew Scott Moriarty is so different, obviously, than the Miss Sherlock Moriarty, who I think is actually a really interesting one, um, because they're there. I'm trying not to spoil anything in case people haven't seen Miss Sherlock, but they should watch Miss Sherlock
We haven't.
because what's that?
I said that we haven't.
Oh, it's so good. It's on HBO Max. It's so
I
good. It's
know.
so good. And
I
so I'm
know.
glad I'm not gonna spoil. But the only spoiler is the Moriarty is literally there the entire time. And it's so good because you're not expecting who the Moriarty to be is the Moriarty. And I think they've done a
Mhm.
really interesting job in adapting. I'm trying to remember exactly. Well, I don't want to say more because you haven't seen it, but when you see it, we'll talk again. But I think those pulling out those arc is it going to be like, Andrew Scott is more like sort of the sort of like mad genius,
Mhm.
he's frenetic. I'm like, I don't know if
Mhm.
that's really what I think of as a canonical Moriarty, but it seems to
Right.
work in the context of BBC Sherlock. So
Yes.
drawing out these attributes and exploding them, I think that's gratifying to me because I like differences. You know what I'm saying? I like the differences of adaptation Whereas I'm not really a canonist in any sort of way, so I'm not interested in I would be glad to see just a canon Moriarty like Granada, but there's only so many times I feel like my specific brain type is having ADHD probably and wanting new things all the time. Like
I
that's
think
interesting.
I think it makes sense in terms of, what you actually do for a living, which is working with music, and you have to do things differently with music to make it interesting, and to keep it fresh.
Yeah, I mean, creative people just are restless in the same sort of, right? Like, it- we don't want to write the same thing over and over again, you know?
Hmm.
We don't want to write the same thing. Yeah, but it also in theater and just in good storytelling, right? Like, there are probably, I'm actually, I say I'm not a canonist. I'm not really that read in pastiches either, so I couldn't tell you any really good. Um, I did read the Moriarty first person narrative. Oh my gosh, I should names. It's my age. From the man that wrote House of Silk.
Oh,
Oh,
it is called Moriarty by
yeah.
Anthony Horowitz.
Horowitz. Yeah.
I have not read that book in full. If you want, I think you should check out the Michael Kurland Moriarty books. That's my go-to recommendation.
Hmm.
Um, Unfortunately, Moran only appears in two books, and one of those is a cameo. But Empress of India, absolutely delightful relationship and dynamics between the two of them. So I highly recommend that. And um, yeah,
Do you ever
I lost
ask
my
who
train of
who
thought.
people's favorite Morans are?
No, but do tell us, who was your favorite
Yeah.
brand?
Well, I don't dislike the guy. I don't actually know the actor's name. I'm trying to look him up on IMDb. From Game of Shadows. I actually think he's fairly
Hmm,
effective and kind of fits the mold. But
Paul
um,
Anderson, I think.
yes, of course. Yeah, no, that sounds
Mhm.
right. That sounds totally right. I think Vinnie Jones from Elementary as Moran is terrifying. He's clearly not the upper class Moran,
Hmm.
but he's terrifying. Because for a while you also think that he's Moriarty. Because he's that
Mm.
terrifying. But I'm like, no, I've always liked his. I mean, he's just evil and feral and has amoral. But then you realize why he's doing it, and it's like, oh no, there's actually a reason he's under the sway of Moriarty. I like the Audible Moran as well. So
Yes.
those famous gents. So um, yeah, I don't know why I thought that. I was like, oh, Morans, that's a good.
Well, we always love Moran on this podcast.
Yes.
I figured.
Okay, one last question. So, what is one canon story besides the final problem, empty house, value theory that you think Moriarty was definitely involved in?
Oh, I've heard you ask people this question before on this podcast. I am so corrupted by Granada that I totally buy it
Yeah.
as headcanon that the Red-Headed League is totally
Mm.
something orchestrated. I mean, I just like I can't. I'm sure I saw that version in the 80s before I ever read the story, and then anytime I
Right.
read the story, I'm like a little bit disappointed
Yeah.
that there's no mention of Moriarty. Um,
Well,
I love the idea.
it's not just that they included him, it's that they actually laid out in the dialogue the reasons for including him. They made a case for it. That
Yeah,
makes sense.
yeah, and I think Gus and Luke talked about it maybe on their podcast about the show that it's like, well, or Michael Cox talked about it in the book, or Benny,
Hmm.
someone talked about it in one of the books about the Granada show. It's like, well, what they really were doing was just making sure the audiences knew who Moriarty was,
Right.
because he just doesn't show up until the final problem, and
Yeah.
that doesn't make for good TV,
Right.
like. So I think it makes total sense in that context.
Hmm.
That's definitely one. I mean, I think BBC Sherlock. I don't think we can go all the way back to a study in Scarlet like they do, but I love that. I love that. That already, and we can talk about this or transition into this. But like the first time we hear the Moriarty music in BBC Sherlock is already in that episode when the taxi driver is like, he's trying to get who made you do this, who made you do this, as the man is dying, and we hear the music, and you're like,
Mhm.
oh my gosh, the music is there, right? Like the first time you see it, you don't know that's what it is, but then later on it comes up. So um, I'll have to think about that one some more. But I am definitely corrupted into the redheaded league. I'm like, that's clearly, I'm actually disappointed every time I read it. I'm like,
Yeah.
but there's no Moriarty, that would make the story so much cooler.
Oh, I love that. Well, before we get talking more about actual Moriarty music, there's just one more thing that we wanted to ask you about, which is sketches of Scions, because that's a neat little thing that you've been doing for a while now.
It is. That is a me project. That's a me project. I mean, I guess it accidentally came about when the Legion of Zoom was created and they were going to have their first conference. And I just said, oh, can I don't know. It's like I don't know. For me, when I go to a conference, I'm like, I need like hype music or, like that's what I think of, is like music playing before the conference starts or whatever. And that sets the tone. And so I just asked Steve Mason, would he be interested in something? And or maybe I wrote it. I don't even remember now. It hasn't been that long ago, but just over a year or so ago. Um, maybe I wrote it and said, "Here, I wrote this. Would you all be interested?" In the thing. And then, I mean, this that wasn't. This is. I don't think this is true. There's no way this could be true. But I think Brad Kefauver was like, "Is this the first Sherlockian theme song for a Scion?"
Hmm.
I don't know if that's true. I mean, I feel like that's impossible, but maybe
I
it
feel like
was.
that's true.
Well, I think it might be true, which is like a cool maybe distinction to have. That wasn't what I was intending. I was just like, oh, I want to hear music before a Zoom conference, because that's kind of a cool thing. And Steve turned into a cool countdown. Um, and then I was just like, oh, well, it's helping me to learn how to um, use DAW software, composing on the computer, essentially trying to make things like lots of film composers actually do. Like all of Game of Thrones was composed on a computer until they were so big and famous that the last season they actually had a live orchestra play everything, and you can totally hear the difference if you go back and listen. But like the average
Oh.
listener can't tell the difference, or and most TV soundtracks have a mixture. BBC Sherlock has a mixture of computerized instruments. Clearly like synthesizers and electronic drums, but I mean some of the instruments that are supposed to be real sounding are some instruments sound good on being a fake computer sample, and the more expensive you get into things, um, those guys, Hans Zimmer's got a room full of computers with like big stacks of hard drives running, thousands of processors to make string sounds like real without ever having to use real ones necessarily for even just for the mock-ups before they get the real orchestras to put in. So I just wanted to learn stuff better, and once I found that out, I was like, oh, that's really interesting. It's really a me project though, just to keep composing. And my fall term is generally, unlike the term that I'm in right now, collegiate term, is usually a little bit lighter, so I have more time to
Mhm.
do stuff, and I like to do other creative projects. So just the idea, but they're just there really are just sketches. It's like I think of like the French impressionistic painters that just set up an easel and try to capture that landscape really quickly before the light changes, and it may be a 20-minute drawing, and that's it. It's not like necessarily it has to be a masterwork. It's just
Mhm.
more like when I think about the names of the Scions or other things, just to put out music that I think fits with the tone or I don't know. The first series is more the Scions that I've been able to participate in
Mhm.
very regularly because of COVID, which enabled me to be in Scions at all. Actually,
Mhm.
when we lived in Scotland, we were members of the Sherlock Holmes Society of Scotland, which was kind of
Oh.
our real first like meetings where we would hang out with people. We like hosted their Christmas party at our flat, and it was like really fun time. We're still friends with a lot of them on Facebook, and so when COVID happened, I was able to actually get to meetings. Um, than just meeting other people and seeing how different meetings are run, similarly or differently or whatever. So yeah, I'm just sort of composing stuff for my own self to keep being creative, but the structure is that idea. Some of them have actually said, "Oh, this is cool. This is our new official theme song," or put it up on their website. Others I have heard nothing from, and that's totally okay because it's really honestly has been for me to keep writing and try different styles of music and try to keep it sounding Sherlockian, which I think is a vague concept that we all know.
Mhm.
Like that doesn't really sound Sherlockian enough, but if you ask any single person, including me, what that means, I don't really actually know what that means.
Yeah.
Um,
Right. And
even
I
when we
feel
look at
like
the
Hans Zimmer also like expanded what Sherlockian can sound like. I think that there's more of a connection, probably more of a connection between Granada and BBC Sherlock than there is between like Granada and the Ritchie movies in terms of soundtrack. But nevertheless, it's like I don't know. I listen to the soundtracks and I'm like, yeah, this is Sherlockian. I still buy this, but it's different. So yeah, it's gotten trickier, shall we say, to kind of define what Sherlockian means in terms of music.
well, and it's weird though too because so this is a really weird thing about something like this is I play this game with my kids in the car. If we're going back to the East Coast or we're pretty close to St. Louis, like 2 hours to the airport, an hour and 40 minutes to the Arch, like close.
Mhm.
Um, and sometimes I just play them random stuff and I'm like, what does this sound like? And the first time I played them, like Granada, they literally said that sounds like Sherlock Holmes. I'm like, how do you as a 5 and a 6-year-old know what that feels like and sounds like, and how does that get inputted into our brains? Like, how do we, or they're like, it's someone solving a mystery. I'm like, okay, is that because you think it sounds like Scooby Doo? Like what defines, those characteristics
Mhm.
um to all of us where we go, oh yeah, of course. But that's like asking what makes Sherlock Holmes Sherlock Holmes. And I think that's the fun problem. This is probably more along adaptation studies, which I wish I had. But like, what makes Sherlock Holmes Sherlock Holmes? People will still argue about that, whether you're
Mhm.
from a canonist all the way to being okay with, I don't know. I really like the Sherlock Holmes. Lots of people haven't watched this in the anime 221B Kabukicho,
Mm.
which is on
You've been
Hulu.
telling me about that.
Yeah, he's really wild, but he's like the actor Sherlock Holmes, but he's doing a Japanese style of theatricality, kabukicho, in order to solve the crime. But it's really weird, and it's not like any other Sherlock Holmes. And some people go, "Well, then that's not Sherlock Holmes. He never did that in the stories." It's like, well, actually, to me, that's a really smart way. He basically becomes an actor playing the characters in the drama, and he talks to himself in this traditional Japanese theatrical style with different voices and everything. It'd be like I'm talking to
Mhm.
you all, and then suddenly I'm talking in a different voice to solve the crime, and I'm talking to myself. Well, that's a really bad solution. Well, I think you know what I'm saying? It's like really
Uh-huh.
disconcertingly bizarre, and Sherlockians mostly probably wouldn't like it. But I'm also like, it's a really smart way to make the explanation of the crime and the
Mhm.
solving of the crime like really interesting. So
Mhm.
it's not Sherlockian, not unlike, you know, Sherlockiana to me. It's just a different way of taking one of those attributes. So I feel that same way about all of the soundtracks, really. And I agree with your assessment that certain ones kind of feel the same, but I'm like, Hans Zimmer and Patrick Gowers have some kind of similarities. But I mean, I don't know. I don't know what people think. I don't know. I have very clear thoughts as a musician, like why certain things work, but that
Mhm.
doesn't mean that everyone has to agree with that. Um, I think generally some of people's most favorite score is The Private Life of Sherlock
Mhm.
Holmes,
Mhm.
right? and that's Miklos Rozsa,
Hmm.
who basically took an existing piece, like his violin concerto, and like retconned it for the soundtrack. And
Hmm.
it's like one of the most beloved, beautiful Sherlockian movie soundtracks for the private life of Sherlock Holmes. And I'm like,
Hmm.
to me, it is one of the greatest, while simultaneously being the least effective as a
Yeah.
score itself. Like it doesn't feel like it fits the score at all. It's beautiful, it's glorious. It is maybe even Sherlockian because it sort of hints like the Hans Zimmer music at sort of Roma culture
Mm.
and the sort of melodic and harmonic content of what we associate with Roma culture,
Hmm.
which Hans Zimmer leaned into and actually had Roma musicians come and play for
And that's
Game of
really
Shadows.
cool.
Um, but it feels like that because of the Hungarian nature of,
Mhm.
I think he's Hungarian. I have to look it up.
That sounds right. Yeah, no, I always thought that that was an odd choice in terms of music for Sherlock Holmes because it just, to me, it sounds like golden age of Hollywood music score, and that's not what I would associate with Sherlock Holmes at all. Um, and also it's very it, at and at the same time it's very romantic, which then
Hmm.
there's the ongoing debate about Holmes's feelings towards oh gosh, I don't even remember her name now, but
Yes, yeah,
the
yes,
main female character, but
yes.
the music sure ships it.
Right, right. And and also like how far is Holmes a romantic character, meaning like in love versus being a romantic character as an archetypal Victorian
Yeah.
romantic bohemian kind of,
Hmm.
character who lives the sort of free life of l leisure and solving crime without any
Hmm.
seeming means of income. I mean, he's closer to me in some ways to romantic characters from like La Boheme,
Hmm.
who are just poor artists and they do what they can and they eat, and when they get money they have a big party and they eat in a fancy restaurant and they spend all the money on alcohol and then they're poor again. Like it's all kind of happening at the same time. So yeah, I don't know, that's always a tricky one for me because I think if you go back to the Basil Rathbone films, they're generally like stock music.
Hmm.
um and I know that the Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, I think, was Cyril Bennett and um not Cyril Bennett, I have to think of his name. Cyril Mockridge but I do know Robert Russell Bennett. And
Hmm.
Robert Russell Bennett as an orchestrator is extraordinarily important in my line of work because he was the orchestrator for Rodgers and Hammerstein. So if you've seen the Dream
Oh.
Ballet, the original Dream Ballet in Oklahoma, he wrote it. He did
Hmm.
all of the orchestra. If you've seen Carousel, he orchestrated all of it. Do you know what I'm saying? Like he's a super important, but at the same time, around the same time period, he was sort of doing canned stock generic adventure music.
Hmm.
Um, and some of that was pulled into the Basil Rathbone films, and it's like that's all great music. It feels sort of dramatic and Sherlockian of the time, but at the same time, it just sort of feels like generic adventure music. Whereas at the same time, like the Alfred Hitchcock music was coming out, and it was very specific to that show or to that up to those movies. And I mean, they literally were just going, "Here's an adventure sequence. What do we have on the shelf that could fit? That sounds adventure-y?" Um, I feel like some of them, maybe the first two before they switched studios, were written more. It's been I guess maybe 2 years since I last watched the Rathbones, but I feel like a couple of them had a little bit more cohesion. Like, oh, this is the sound of this is sort of the Sherlockian music,
Hmm.
for it. But it's not any much that different than that other TV show with Ronald Howard as Sherlock
Hmm.
Holmes, which I love also, but
Hmm.
that also just feels like sort of generic adventure music that's kind of classical. Whereas I think once we get to Patrick Gowers, there's a whole other level of um putting the private life of Sherlock Holmes aside,
Mhm.
um, putting we haven't talked about this yet, but putting Dashkevich's score for the first Russian Sherlock Holmes that's
Mm.
taking place at the same time or right before Granada, like the 80s,
Mhm.
which I think is an extraordinary series.
Mhm.
Um, that also has a really interesting soundtrack because it's Russian written. It doesn't sound like it's trying to sound like British music, you know. The opening's really famous in Russia. Um, People post it on the middle school, concert bands are playing the opening of that theme song on YouTube once a week or something. Another one pops out in Russia. It's like it's as famous there as like BBC Sherlock would be to us. All you have to hear is and you're like, oh, it's BBC Sherlock. The opening drum hits. Um, but I think Daskevich for that series did a lot of interesting and innovative stuff, including bringing back musical ideas. And I think this is where it started going, is taking musical motives, right? Taking melodies that we recognize, doing interesting things with them in different ways, and then like coding information into that, including about Moriarty.
Mhm.
Um, so by the time Gowers comes around, Daskevich has been writing some stuff, but they like overlap, and it's like really interesting because I feel like I don't know if they were able to hear each other's music or if they each saw each other's shows, you know?
I don't
It
think
probably
that
would be
they were
impossible.
able to.
Yeah, I don't think so either because the Cold War would have been like really in the height at the 80s and
Uh-huh.
but they do some really interestingly like similar sorts of things sound-wise. Um and by the time we get to the Robert Downey Jr. and BBC Sherlock, there's so much more conceptuality of like how do I write the score that makes it sound like with information that I can use in different ways, right? There's more melodies that we can all recognize when they slyly come in over this scene or they slyly come over in this scene. Like it's a little bit more like people are dropping clues, for the listener to hear. Um, and I know that's true because Patrick Gowers literally told me he did that. Michael Price actually told me, yeah, of course, there are clues all over the place musically if you can figure out, they may not be um, readily apparent to everyone, even not to musicians, but for him as a composer, he was trying to feel like he was putting some clues into that. And we hear that now, now that that's exploded in like Marvel, the MCU. We all know what Spider-Man's old music sounds like, his new music, the Tobey Maguire, right? Like that's more of a soundtrack practice that has developed since the Rathbone series
Mhm.
has come up, I think.
Mhm. Um, ch- Something that you just said in passing, now I want to ask about. You said that there were like some similarities between Patrick Gowers and Hans Zimmer in composing for Sherlock Holmes. So like what? Because they're two very different sounding scores.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like partially like the tonality of things,
Mhm.
right? So let's go to Moriarty because that's your podcast.
Yeah.
So like the Patrick Gowers Moriarty theme is like really interesting, and
Mhm.
we'll get the piano going here hopefully. Okay, great. So like the Moriarty music is the similarities generally um right are that villains, and I'm not really sure why. I was trying to actually read some articles about this before I came on the podcast, and I sort of skimmed some, but like from opera tradition, the bass is always the villain.
Mhm.
I don't know what the cause of that is in humanity, but essentially, I think thinking that taller, I mean, think of like Vinnie Jones as Moran in Elementary.
Mhm.
He's this gigantic, muscular guy. Um, and
Think
there's
of
something
James Earl Jones voicing Darth Vader.
100%, 100%, exactly the same. There's something about the correlation, and I don't know that it's necessarily a positive correlation because I think it can get into like body phobia kinds of things,
Mhm.
arguments really quickly.
Mhm.
Um, but I do think that somewhere along the lines in earlier like Western societies, people were like, these gigantic hulking men that are going to play the bruisers, it's going to play Don Giovanni, um, that there's something more animalistic about a low voice,
Mhm.
and I can't say that because I've got a SpongeBob voice, right? And I'm a tiny person, but generally, like, my voice type plays the romantic lead. Not me, but like a tenor generally plays the romantic lead. So
Mhm.
one of the similarities about all of the Moriarty musics generally, except for the Russian one, which is really disconcertingly bizarre, but in a great way, um, they're all gonna be in the like really sub bass, low bass register. So like the Hans Zimmer one starts on like some really low note like that, and it's like, right? And every time you hear that, you're like, Moriarty is doing some stuff. So
That is so ominous.
it's but it's like, why is it ominous to us just hearing low notes play really close notes? I think there's some theories that psychologically it's like because we associate like these gigantic bruiser villain men with animalistic tendencies,
Hmm.
and the bigger the person, the lower the voice usually,
Hmm.
because physically not 100% in any way, right? Like there,
Right.
I know 6'4" um, men that are tenors, so it doesn't really relate to real life. But in terms of like stereotypes and archetypes,
Hmm.
they're just like they're more animalistic, and so the bad guys are acting upon their animal desires, their animal impulses. Doesn't matter that Moriarty is an intellectual genius. He's
Hmm.
committing crimes, he's getting people murdered. These are all animalistic tendencies. And the bigger the animal, the bigger the voice, right? And the lower the voice usually, um, for those sorts of men. That's what I think. I think it's a weirdly
Hmm.
patriarchal idea that's sort of inserted itself. Like big, gigantic, hulking men have really low voices, and because they've got really low voices, that's what a bad guy sounds like. And so when the musicians come to do it, it could also relate to Christocentric ideas of like hell being low, heaven being up and hell being down, that like these notes down here feel like hell or criminality or something. So they're almost always bases. And I know so the Hans Zimmer score, most of the soundtrack that says shadows next to the
Hmm.
it's like it has got a subtitle of shadows that's like that is my curse, TikTok and chess, and it'll say like
Hmm.
colon shadows. All have Moriarty content, and then there's also I'm gonna look at notes here. The Red Book, Moral Insanity, and this is my I already said that is my curse. So there's a couple other ones that have Moriarty content or underscoring Moriarty, but it's always got um, those low strings or really low instruments playing for us to feel. Now why is it, I don't know, you're like that feels ominous, but I think we're conditioned to think that feels ominous because it's low. um and Patrick Gower does that too because his is goes really low too. It's like
Hmm.
that's probably that's like probably an octave too low, but there's just something angular and inharmonious about that as well, right? So we're like the villain, he can't, it's not going to be like right? That's like the heroes. That's like it's like major. So there's something like minor oriented about a villain generally.
Hmm.
I honestly think there's something minor about Sherlockians. Every time I write something in major for one of the sketches of science, I don't think people feel it's Sherlockian enough. As soon as if I took the exact same thing and try to make it in minor key sounding, because
Hmm.
mysteries and crime and
Hmm.
like things happening in the shadows,
Hmm.
that can't feel major. That doesn't feel like a satisfactory crime. There's something about in our brains minor music and crime, I think.
Hmm.
Um, and then for the villains, that really low orchestral music. Now, Um, Patrick Gowers uses low strings, but he also, if I remember correctly, uses the bassoon to play that line, which is like again a really tall, gigantic instrument. But I love that choice for two reasons. Um, One is the bassoon has a really gigantic range, and it can play actually really high, as well
Mhm.
as play especially like a contra bassoon can play these like ridiculously low notes, like a pipe organ low pedal notes that like can vibrate the room. Um,
Mhm.
and I think that there's something about this tall, lanky instrument that fits like the Eric Porter Paget
Mhm.
drawing that's got range. Do you know what I'm saying? It's got range. It can play the low notes and be the villain, but it can also play some high, quirky notes and sound kind of interesting. Um, I think that's really interesting. And I don't know if he did this on purpose, but in the Basil Rathbone, in the Pursuit to Algiers, in that movie, which is a very musical, it's one of my favorite. It's when those movies start getting more campy, I think they're actually better. Um, and there's so much music in that particular movie, but in that movie, there's a conversation between Holmes and Watson, and they're discussing like Watson says something like, "Well, that person can't be bad. They play an instrument." And Holmes is like, you know, talking about the fact that musical competence doesn't mean isn't a sign of virtue. Essentially, he says something along those lines in a very Basil Rathbone way. He's like,
Mhm.
"Late Professor Moriarty was a virtuoso on the bassoon." It's like, yes. But they like literally talk about in that movie somehow in headcanon now Moriarty played the bassoon. I don't know if he needs to play an instrument because Sherlock Holmes, as his inverse mirror, needs to play an
Mhm.
instrument. I mean, but also in one of those movies, Watson is playing the tuba. So like, I don't know. I don't know if Patrick Gowers was like, oh, Moriarty plays the bassoon, so I will have the bassoon play Moriarty music, or because it's sort of a reedy woodwind with a lot of range that can
Mhm.
show the sort of narrow intellectual the sound itself to me shows like a sort of narrow intellectual capacity, like
Mhm.
very like systemically thinking. There's just something
Mhm.
that sound that I could associate that to, but also they plays the low notes. That is also why your theme song has a bassoon
Yes,
playing the
it
harpsichord.
we really love it so much, so
Yes.
thank you.
Yeah, well, I'm glad, but I made a conscious decision. I was like, well, Moriarty in one of the movies in headcanon plays the bassoon, and also because you all have done stuff with the Granada Moriarty so often, I'm like, that's also a bassoon, and so there's somehow now in my brain Moriarty sounds like the bassoon, whereas in like BBC Sherlock, he's also low strings.
Mhm.
That whole that's all low strings. There's just something villainous and restless. But also, BBC Sherlock, he plays his ringtone is "Staying Alive," which is obviously a meta, like hint at at Holmes and Moriarty's relationship. Like,
Mhm.
who's gonna survive in the end? And we know who's gonna survive, but like we were talking earlier, we want to see how he does it.
Mhm.
We want to see how they do it. So I don't know if that really answers the question, but I'm just like, I think it's just that like that old opera convention. It's like
Mhm.
bad people have low notes, man.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think about Lord of the Rings, like the Isengard theme, that's very
Yeah.
low, lots of percussion, feels
Yes.
heavy. Of course, uh Imperial March. I mean, it's a march, it's a genuine march, but
Yeah.
you couldn't mistake that for being anything other than villainous.
Right. And
Um,
again, the question is always to me why, and that's the only you all have may have better solutions as to like, well, it sounds like, but I do think the reason it's just because it's like low and ominous.
Maybe it's just that we all like all people have some form of synesthesia, and some things just genuinely sound like this or that to us.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. I also think
I
that
was
it's constructed. Sorry, Dixie, go ahead.
I was just gonna say it also like the low notes remind me of the rumbling of thunder as well.
Mm.
I love that. I
Mhm.
love that. I think that's as valid as any other. I'm like, it's all. I love that. I think I like, and people are scared of thunder. I do think, like I was saying earlier, that it's like trained. It's like learned behavior a
Mhm.
little bit. We just all assume that the villain is going to have low notes because we've just accepted it from
Mhm.
years of soundtracking.
Mhm.
And I'm not sure that was always the case. And so I think we have been taught by association from birth listening to soundtracks that that could be what it is.
Well, then that makes me wonder because I don't really have a serious knowledge um of classical music.
Mhm.
Basically like any music pre 1900, but even less music pre 1800, like in operas and stuff. Is that still carried through, that idea of low notes being villainous?
I mean, yes, but then on the other hand, for again, this could be some weird like patriarchal embedding that we're like literally teasing out right now because like when the villainous women sing things very often, they're crafty, which means they're singing really high and artistic. So like the Queen of the Night aria that everyone knows, she's trying to convince someone to stab someone else. And everyone's like, "Oh, that's a really pretty aria. It's really showy." But like she's trying to get the other person to kill someone. So I don't know what that says about like the archetypes, the stereotypes that we've, you know, sort of inherited, and if there's
Mhm.
ways to change them. Um, Whereas in like musical theater, there aren't a lot of bass roles at all left. They're all high rock tenor boys, essentially. And occasionally a bass voice is like Collins from Rent, but he's clearly a good guy. He's a subversive, character within the world. Um, because he's like hates capitalism and is robbing. He's a Robin Hooder essentially, but he's like a good guy, right?
Mhm.
He happens to sing in the bass range, but it has nothing to do with the quality of his character. So I think we do have some sort of opposite, ideas. I mean, just thinking like how things have changed over time, like gender constructs have been very fluid almost all of history, actually,
Mhm.
until marketing. And then in the 20s, they're like, boys should be pink because they're vivacious and outgoing, and girls should be blue because they're docile and muted. Well, we laugh at that now because now if you're like doing a gender reveal party, the colors are reversed because it's totally made up.
Mhm.
Totally made up. And I do think
Mhm.
little level of like base people are closer to animals and animalistic, which is totally just made up.
Right.
And could be deconstructed by someone smarter than me to be like, but even now, like think about Disney women, like the fake mom in Tangled is kind of a contralto. Like Donna Murphy's a really low voice. I mean, she's an incredible performer, singer. Like,
Mhm.
um, Mother Knows Best.
Mhm.
Ursula in The Little Mermaid. Pat Carroll is a really low voice contralto, so we still even have it sort of crossing over. I
Mhm.
just don't know where it fits necessarily, but just yes, generally the opera conventions were that the tenors were the high, like the were the ingenue roles, the high sopranos were the ingenue roles. In musical theater, we sort of get that because the belter alto roles, like Ado Annie, are like the less refined characters. Um, Maybe a little bit, some very often the secondary love triangle with the alto belter is the promiscuous character. So I have this gut intuition that we're sort of received some sort of genderized things, just as like if we're talking about a totally different medium, if we're talking about like pot boiler, like the new Perry Mason HBO, right? Any sort of film noir is going to be soundtracked with jazz.
Mhm.
Well, that is inherently racist because, and I'm not one that just normally throws that kind of thing around, but essentially there was in the 1920s this association that was completely racist between blackness and crime.
Mhm.
And what kind of music are going to use to score your crime drama? Philip Marlowe's going to solve this, or the or they're gonna find the Maltese Falcon, where we all think of like, I think iconically in a totally different way, it's like the opening of Who Framed Roger Rabbit, which is the most bluesy like wail of jazz music, and the whole score is jazz, but it's still a mystery crime. It's still a
Mhm.
murder mystery, it just happens to be with cartoons, right? But inherently, that's because people used to think that jazz was degenerate, but that's because minstrelsy and other practices had trained people to associate
Mhm.
not whiteness, it not even just not whiteness, but in blackness, with
Mhm.
the things that the movie The Birth of the Nation, the KKK minstrel shows were trying to inculcate into people's minds, right? We haven't really had a jazz version of Sherlock Holmes that I'm aware of or that I can think of or that I've seen anyway as a soundtrack
Mhm.
make more sense. So I think because we're thinking about Victorian Edwardian times, that's the end of the Romantic movement, right? We're getting Wagner, we're getting motivic development, we're getting orchestra, we're getting classical sounding music. That really everyone is still leaning on that,
Mhm.
except for the modern TV shows like Sherlock and Elementary, which obviously are recontextualized. And they sort of created their own other logic for how things work. But even BBC Sherlock, the Moriarty music is low, ominous strings. So I don't know. That was a very long answer with a lot of like avenues, but I just like I still kind of question in a Moriarty podcast, like, well, why does it sound? What makes it sound evil? Does it have to be low? Which I think is what's interesting about like the Daskevich, like the Russian one. It's like a really weird synthesizer from the 80s. It's like in that range with like this really weird electronic synthesizer sound. And it has some low rumblings and all, but like his main theme is basically in that spoken singing range um,
Mhm.
that most high voices would generally speak or sing in, right? So, but that's a very different version of Moriarty because he's kind of a hunchback and he's sort of like kind of weird, you know? He's kind of a
Spidery.
yeah, that's exactly. I love that. No, he is spidery, and his music sounds kind of weirdly spider. I love that. It sort of is just kind of like more like a I don't know, like sort of a freak show Moriarty or something. I'm not sure what they were going for, and I'm not sure that's a politically correct thing to say, but you know what I'm saying? I'm just like
Yeah.
it,
No.
he's not like the intense Jared Harris. He's not like the super smart, ominous Eric Porter.
Mhm.
So they wrote the music to feel like the man with his cane hunched over trying to, you know, kill
Mhm.
Holmes. So it sort of fits in a different way, but it's not the old bass thing.
Mhm.
So
That's
there is
right.
an exception. So its characterization is different, right? And so the music
Mhm.
is different. I can say two other things that are also interesting, like about the modern use of like the way that people use. And I've put this out on the internet before, and other people have also put this out on the internet. But I think it's like really cool because one of the things right in that sort of idea of the eternal battle between Holmes and Moriarty, like Hans Zimmer uses his ticking clock
Mhm.
all over everything, right? Tenet, Inception, they're all about time, bending time, space, whatever. Um, and he gets that chess clock in there in a lot of the sequences with Moriarty and Holmes. And that idea that it's the game and the game of chess between the black knight and the white knight or the king or whoever, you know,
Mhm.
the light side and the dark side, very, very binary sort of way of looking at storytelling. Um, and I think that's really cool. Um, that they've got that next level. It's the game of shadows, but and they talk about chess and they literally play chess and the chess clock is ticking. So I think there's there's a better meta understanding um, of how these villains work. I don't
Mhm.
know if he intended this, but I do think that Patrick Gowers, because he was this smart and this intentional a lot of the time,
Mhm.
when he did the Moriarty theme, besides being dissonant and angular and like making us ill at ease, it embedded in each of those phrases, the first note and the last note
Mhm.
is a tritone, which is where any, if you have a scale and you cut it in half, it's where the half point is, but weirdly when you cut the scale in half, it's really dissonant. It's the most dissonant interval besides the really close ones. And it's got this really weird not feeling like it's in a tonality sort of feeling. And that construction of that melody, there's one, and then it goes again. So there's two between the first note and the second note. And there's a really low tritone, F sharp to C. And back in the day, some scholars are debating this and sort of refuting this. But even when I was in college in the late 90s, that was called the Devil's Interval. So it's like within the character of Moriarty being like the most evil, he's embedded all these devil's intervals. I think he did that on purpose. I mean, I'm like, he would have seen that as the devil's interval. And a lot of the time in Granada, when something bad is happening, the basses go like, which is the devil's interval. So a lot, like in non-Moriarty things, you'll hear especially in the first season, you'll hear the crime is happening or someone's sneaking around at night, and you'll hear like a chord, and the bass will go devil's interval, because someone's being mischievous, something's committing a crime essentially, and so I think that's really interesting. He's embedded 3 devil's intervals into his Moriarty line essentially. I think that's really interesting. And then the other one that is really cool to me is if you take the Moriarty from BBC Sherlock, because they completely work in cellular melody, motivic development sorts of ways as well. If you go back to the original, right, it's not in the right octave, but in this line right here, it's like here going up, going down for Sherlock, right? Like that's his hero motive. Moriarty's is actually the exact same music, but it goes up, like to meet Sherlock or something. You can read it different ways, but like you put the two of them together, they're the same melody, which I think plays into the whole idea of them being two sides of the same coin, or the idea that Moriarty is pushing in that version of Moriarty, like we're the same. I mean, I don't know. That's pretty freaking brilliant that Michael Price and David Arnold were able to figure that out in the very first. I'm not sure what kind of conversations they had with, Moffat and Gatiss to be like, no, we're going to play on that idea that Moriarty thinks that they're the same person. They're like intellectual doppelgangers. There's two sides of the same coin, which again, I think is what we love about the two characters. But they literally wrote the melody for Moriarty to basically be the same exact 3 first notes as Sherlock. But when you hear them in context or different keys, you don't get that. And when you put Sherlock back in context, it's harder to hear. If the melody went, you still most people, I don't think I would hear it, as a professional musician, because it's contextualized in a totally radically different way. But I think that's like a really cool, like meta understanding of the characters that they've written in, and they literally have just used essentially 5 notes. The first 3 are the same. One goes up, which is Moriarty, and one goes down, which I poetically, metaphorically think of. Sherlock's got to take the fall in that version. So I think I don't know if that's how they wrote it, but I mean, they clearly wrote those 2 melodies to be intertwined in that sort of intellectual doppelganger way. I think that's the most Moriarty cool of Moriarty cool that I have found in a film soundtrack. It doesn't get any more intentional than that, and that does help us trace all the way back from stock stock music that they just pulled off the shelf that was adventure music for Basil Rathbone to I'm writing something specifically for each character that any Sherlockian that loves, BBC Sherlock, as soon as you hear in any context, you're like, that's Moriarty.
Mm-hmm.
And when you go back and listen to it, and you're like, there are things happening on screen that have nothing to do with Moriarty, but you might hear, you're like, oh my gosh, Moriarty is involved somehow.
Mm-hmm.
So they've taken that sort of Wagnerian idea of motives that relate to characters and brought it to, which happens in Lord of the Rings, which happens in Star Wars, like you said,
Mm-hmm.
Darth Vader's theme, whatever. As
Mm-hmm.
soon as you hear, especially if it's low in like Clone Wars or Rebels, like the cartoons of Star Wars,
Mm-hmm.
Anakin gets mad. Very often you'll hear it in the bass, it'll just go with
Right.
on top, and you're like, oh my gosh, she's turning to Darth Vader, right? So it's this very
Right.
similar sort of like
Mm-hmm.
villainous move for Moriarty.
Well, and actually, similarly, with Anakin, um, John Williams wrote Anakin's childhood theme music as kind of the reverse of the Imperial March. And if you listen to the whole thing, you do get the actual like first few notes of Imperial March at the very end of it, just to emphasize
Yes,
it.
yes.
Um,
And Rey's theme actually has the Emperor's theme embedded into it.
really?
She's a Palpatine.
Well, I know, but she wasn't a Palpatine until the third movie.
I think he knew. I think he knew. I think they knew. I don't know because that theme could have been, they kept talking about whether she's going to be a Kenobi or if she's going to be something else, a Palpatine. She's choosing to be a Skywalker, but like I think they already. I don't know. I can see some
Mhm.
Obi-Wan. Well, Obi-Wan didn't actually have a theme until
Right,
the TV show, so I
right.
don't. There's no way to make a relation. Whereas I don't remember what the Emperor's theme is, but it's basically the same thing as Rey's music, the little flute.
I'm seeing it now. I can see it now. Oh my gosh.
Yeah. So it's like there. But again, we haven't talked about John Williams, but he is the master of. He has brought this to modern
Hmm.
film scoring, like in our lifetime, and then
Hmm.
everyone else is sort of like, oh, John Williams made all the character, and then Howard Shore and Lord of the Rings, like everyone's got their own, theme. Now that carries over into Game of Thrones. People have their own music, right? Like the characters have their own identifying music.
Hmm.
So it makes sense in our modern context. Moriarty's got his own music, and at least at least from the '80s forward, there might be other instances. Um, I don't think in the Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, I never really heard anything that felt Moriarty-esque. That whatever was he a Peruvian assassin or something like that? Played the flute the whole, you'd hear that weird, really weird
Hmm.
flute melody um, throughout that one, and whenever someone heard that flute melody, he killed them like really soon, soon afterwards, right? Wasn't that the Adventures of Sherlock Holmes? It was like a weird, like uh,
I have only like seen the Adventures of Sherlock Holmes all the way through like once
once, yeah,
when I'm
no,
not in it.
I've only watched it twice
Um,
to figure out that what that melody was. But like
mhm.
that's kind of like a cipher for Moriarty, right? Because he's like pulling the strings of the guy that's trying to
Mhm.
kill people essentially. But I don't think that anything that's clearly written for the movie, either by Cyril Mockridge or Robert Russell Bennett. I have no idea which of the two. That's the two
Mhm.
people listed. Um, so there is something that feels a little bit Moriarty-esque about that weird angular flute melody of right? He's got those bolas, right? He's like tries to he like kills people with the bolas and throws them at them. I don't know. But he's got his own little he like literally plays like some sort of pan flute or something as a character, but he's the assassin. He's like the Moran in that version.
Okay.
So there is something that feels a little bit like a disconcerting, but again, that's played on like a flute, so it is like a high version. So maybe
Mhm.
the angularity is another, the idea of a villain having sort of weird, disconcerting, not singable, melodic, chromatic
Yeah. Well, I mean,
theme.
you think about like scare chords and such, like those are high. There are some, like higher pitched music is the only way I can think to.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, like
I
this,
don't have the language for it, but
Psycho, right? Like the strings in Psycho, where they're just going, but like probably an octave higher. Which I think because I think it's supposed to be like a woman screaming.
mhm.
It feels like someone like again like a woman screaming in terror essentially, and so they. But I also those sort of villainous moments in like Hitchcock movies. Very often there's a big spread between something that's happening in like the bass or the drums with that high shrieky thing also happening. So there's something disconnected between the middle is empty, and that's also like a little disconcerting for us for some reason as humans that there's like things aren't filled out. It's just like low rumbles and then like really high stabby stabby strings going on. Um, yeah, I mean, someone will come up with a new Moriarty and a new version of Moriarty, and the soundtrack may sound like totally innovative and different and not rely on these conventions, and that would be super cool.
Well, I mean, speaking of that, what about the music in Moriarty the Patriot? How does that tie
Yeah,
in with all that we've been talking about?
the anime ones are tricky for me. Um, I was actually listening to what's it called, Dying Wish, on the way over to my office, like the theme song to Moriarty the Patriot, the
Mhm,
first couple seasons.
mhm.
Um, the only thing about Moriarty the Patriot music that I actually remember, I'm like trying to see if I have notes somewhere to the Patriot in my note. I have a big list of notes of all the things that I watch. Every time I watch a Sherlock Holmes thing, I'm like, oh, it's this or that, and I try to keep notes on things. Um, Murder by Decree. Here's all the Living-Offs. I don't even think I took notes when I watched Moriarty the Patriot. I remember that what I remember about those are the commercial bumpers where it's something like, and then it's like shows the family crest and it just plays like a strings going or something like that. That's
Mhm.
literally all I remember. Tell me more about guide my memory back to what because it was a lot of like rock music and kind of feeling things, right?
I still haven't watched the whole thing. And it's been a while. It's I mean, because it's subtitles and it always
Mm-hmm.
for me it's a concentration thing. It's like I can watch something with subtitle. I don't have a problem with it like some people I know some people do. Um, but like I have to be ready to put in that mental work to
Yes, yes,
do
yes,
it.
understood. Yes, understood.
So
Um, I mean, I remember it feeling fairly ominous, but I don't want to also say generic TV soundtracking, but I didn't feel anything like to the same level of some of the other composers we're talking about. I
that's
mean, same thing with like Miss Sherlock. Like I generally watch these things and try to take notes. I feel like the last time I watched Miss Sherlock was because my wife had never seen it, didn't know it, and I was like, "Wait, how have you never seen this?" And we've been married for over a decade, you know. And so I was watching it to watch it, um, but I don't remember anything because it kind of felt like sort of past. Some of those sort of modern, TV shows feel pastiche to other things. Like Miss Sherlock's music, the opening is really cool with like the siren and the lock. It's kind of not unlike BBC Sherlock and Elementary, though, right?
Mhm,
Those are the new conventions being set up by composers to the character
right.
things, and I feel like um, that is interesting. I'm not even. I don't really remember that much about Moriarty the Patriot, to be honest. Except for the opening songs, which are like J-pop essentially.
Mhm.
And they're interesting, but they always also don't weirdly fit because they're like J-pop pop songs. The tone doesn't necessarily fit to me.
Right. And at the same time it still works because it's anime.
Right, exactly,
Um,
exactly. I mean, I would say the same thing about 221 Kabukicho 221B or whatever it's called. It has
mhm.
a really cool opening song actually, but it's kind of a cool song because it's a cool song, not because it feels particularly Sherlockian or of the crime world. Again, what does that mean? Like what
Mhm.
that's always my question is like what does that mean? So
Well, what about There were a couple of Sherlockian scores actually for two rather different movies in the 80s done by shoot, I'm not sure actually how to pronounce his name. Henry Mancini.
Yeah, Henry Mancini. Sure, sure, sure.
Mancini. He did Great Mouse Detective and he also did Without a Clue. And in one case he's writing music for Radigan, and then in the other case
Yeah.
there's still some music, as I recall, for Moriarty in Without a Clue. But let's talk briefly about Radigan.
Yeah, I think I can talk. So I own Without a Clue. I've had it on DVD for like maybe 12 years. I've still never seen it, so I can't talk. So, but Henry Mancini is like, right, he would have been the go-to guy because he wrote the Pink Panther. And there's
Oh.
nothing, you know, there's nothing more iconic than just hearing
Yeah.
wherever it goes. Right? Like you just can't not like so he'd already sort of got himself he was an extraordinary jazz composer, an extraordinary orchestrator for film and TV, but also jazz, like that's what I think of him. He wrote songs like The Days of Wine and Roses for the movie, which is like a jazz standard that I play in gigs with jazz quartets, right? So like he is super versatile. It's like he was weirdly like one generation before John Williams, or overlapping. Because Mancini died in the late 90s. I remember this is really weird. I don't remember lots of things from the 90s, but I remember the exact restaurant I was sitting in when I saw on the TV screen on CNN that Henry Mancini had died. Couldn't tell you the year, but yeah, I mean it's a really interesting thing having any Sherlockian character sing to me. And it's clearly coming out of the Disney musical theater tradition, right?
Right.
And I love that it also, though, has like the sort of music hall tradition, like The Adventures of Sherlock, like Basil Rathbone singing, music hall vaudeville
Mhm.
in that movie.
Mhm.
Um, and Do You Like to Be Beside the Seaside, right?
Mhm.
Which is a great music hall like song. And that music hall tradition is played on through various versions. The music hall tradition also, there's a great music hall song that's actually really kind of dirty if you start listening to the words. Um, in if have you all seen the Tom and Jerry
I have.
Sherlock Holmes? I'm not saying it's the world's greatest art. I'm not saying that it's totally appropriate for children to be basically watching a Tom and Jerry equivalent of Jessica Rabbit singing a song about her umbrella, but the song is a banger. Like it's a great song. Bumper shoot, right? And it's fun. And I think Henry Mancini does a really good job of keeping the Great Mouse Detective sort of one foot in the Disney musical world, but also one foot in that sort of not canonical in any way, shape, or form, but headcanon Basil Rathbone singing music hall, which would have been right. That would have been the music that people in you know Upper Swandam Lane would have been singing, right? Like that's what they're kind of the lower class. It's the British equivalent of vaudeville. So they would have been sort of bawdy, nerdy, dirty songs that people were singing, that with lots of double entendres and things. And so basically having Radigan sing something, it shouldn't work in any metric of Moriarty. I don't know if it's because it's Vincent Price, like
I think a lot of it is it being Vincent Price.
yeah, it just works. And the whole bit with the record player and the skipping of the groove and then them trying to shoot the gun off early based on the record going. I don't know. I don't know. I've never thought, oh gosh, that is so cringily not Moriarty. It somehow still works. Because I think to me it does. Other people may totally disagree, but like it works because I think it is Moriarty, right? But it's a Moriarty cipher. It's not really Moriarty, just like
Right.
Basil
Yeah.
isn't really Sherlock Holmes. So I think having a singing rat is acceptable. And I think singing villains occur in all the Disney movies, and I think therefore again that's another convention that we have inherited, I personally think it's delightful.
Mm-hmm.
They often have the best songs.
They always have the best songs.
I love it's World's Greatest Criminal Mind. That's Radigan's
Yeah.
first song, isn't it?
Yeah.
I've listened to that many times.
Yeah, and it totally works again, I think, because inherently at that time, right? Early computer time is all I can think of, right? What year is that? 80, what year is that movie? 80 something, 85,
85, I think.
Yeah, so around the same time as Granada is
Mhm.
coming out on PBS, essentially. Like I was 7. Like I do vaguely remember, I might have a memory of a memory. Do you know what I'm saying?
Uh-huh.
Of seeing that in the movie theater. But I did see it in the movie theater. Um, I think that really having Henry Mancini was the masterstroke because just a little bit in the way he writes, there would have been an association to things like the Pink Panther, which
Mm-hmm.
is the thing that everyone knows that he wrote, whether they know he wrote it or not. Like, and that idea of a spy, like the spy music, but he wasn't writing spy music like Charlie's Angels or Mission Impossible on TV, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or even James Bond, right? It wasn't like a Barry score for James Bond. Henry Mancini made the Pink because it's right. It's a comedy spy, and I think there's something really smart about Disney inviting specifically him over another British composer like Barry who writes James Bond because it might have been more like James Bond, and that's
Mm-hmm.
fun, but it's not funny like the Pink Panther. And The Great Mass Detective is fun and funny, and it's a cartoon, so that's like I don't know. That may be the whole package works because it's Henry Mancini.
Mm-hmm. So you haven't seen Without a Clue?
No, I own it. Never seen it.
My gosh, watch it. It's so
I know. I
good.
know. I just finally saw They Might Be Giants.
That's something that I still need to watch.
Yeah, and it's weird. It's vaguely Sherlockian, but it is Sherlockian, you know?
Mhm.
Um, so there's only so many hours in the day. I mean, I think this also gets to the other things like what do mystery shows sound like, you know? And I couldn't remember Anthony Horitz's name earlier, but I just had watched Magpie Murders, which has a
Mhm.
great soundtrack, which sounds as mystery Sherlockian as anything else is mystery Sherlockian, you know?
Mhm.
And I think like that's I'm paying more attention in general to what TV shows, mystery TV shows. Poker Face has got a great soundtrack and sets of music. I mean, it's totally different. It's like all
Mhm.
banjo and like
Mhm.
really cool sounding. Um, I'm just hopeful that people keep expanding these things, you know? What does
Mhm.
Moriarty sound like? What does Sherlock sound like? Every person that has a good idea and it works, then it works. But no, I've never seen Without a Clue. I don't know how. I mean, literally can tell you exactly on my DVD shelf where it is. That is my homework after this podcast.
It's so wonderful. It's such a smart and affectionate parody. Um, and also I do really like the Moriarty in it. And also technically there's a Moran in it too.
I will watch it and pay attention.
It's so much fun. It hasn't been a serious headcanon, but I kind of headcanon Moriarty as playing the piano since there's a bit of a stereotype about mathematicians, doing piano. But like hearing you also explain all this stuff, and I'm like, there is so much math involved in this. Like,
Hmm.
Moriarty could absolutely play the piano.
I mean, I could totally believe it if someone came up with a piano playing Moriarty because it is math. It is all math. Like, you know,
Mhm.
there's no reason to me that Moriarty. I mean, it would be great depending on how people, you know, read. And there's so many essays, like in the last BSI book on Holmes and music, right? Regarding
Mhm.
my notes, like, is Sherlock Holmes actually good at playing the violin? I can go any way with that, to be honest. I totally buy it that he's terrible and just happens to own a Stradivarius. But I also buy that he owns a Stradivarius and knew what it was to save it from the pawn shop, right? That he
Right.
may have been also extraordinarily talented because of having an intellectual mind. It would be great to have a Holmes that can't play the violin. Like the 2013 Russian Sherlock Holmes cannot play the violin. and it's hilarious. It would be great to have a Moriarty that's like a mathematical genius and like a music theory genius.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe even like a like this like it'd be so great to have like I'm putting out this idea, I'm trademarking it, copywriting it right now on this podcast, where Sherlock Holmes is like one of the reasons there's tension is like a total Mozart Salieri sort of thing, where Holmes is actually really bad at composing music, but because he's a mathematical genius, that Moriarty is like also like a stellar polymath composer
Mm-hmm.
and writing songs for people or writing compositions for orchestras or something. That would be such an interesting different dynamic. Because again, like that Basil Rathbone, somehow when people play music and are really good at it, it suddenly makes them we know from rock star culture now that we know that not everyone that plays music has to be a virtuous or good person. But in that time period, it just seems like all the characters that play music are good. They're the good guys.
Mm-hmm.
It'd be great to have like a really successful composer Moriarty character, and part of the battle is that Holmes is really bad at music.
I like that. I think if anybody ever wants to take that up, definitely the way that Les Klinger gets called in to consult on adaptations, like they
Yes,
call you in to consult.
that would be so cool. I don't think I've studied enough, but it would be so cool. And there's so many other great musical Sherlockians right out there that have done this work for so much longer. I feel like the crew of the Bark Lone Star had a Sherlock Holmes and music quiz, and I was like, oh man, I'm gonna nail this thing. And it was like I got like maybe 4 out of 10 right. And there are people that had 10 out of 10, and I'm like, see, they know their stuff. But that would be a really cool job to be like consulting Sherlockian musician under what pretenses or what, but it would be kind of fun to do.
I think that's a good note to end on.
Yeah,
No
someone,
pun intended.
someone hire me. That's the note.
Yes, 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 exactly. Somebody hire Josh for Sherlockian music purposes in general. Well, Josh, thank you so much for coming on to the show. This has been so much fun.
Yeah, it's been so fascinating as well.
Well, thanks for having me and listening to me ramble on about various topics. It's very professorial. I try to get the older I get, the worse it gets, probably, but here we are.
That's wonderful. I mean, you're very I think you're clearly very good at what you do, and you're very, intelligent and well educated, and it just makes for a fascinating listen for us.
And that's what's great about Sherlockians in general, right? Is that
Absolutely.
everyone's got their thing and they're super good at it, and it's really interesting to hear them talk about all the different presentations that people do.
It has been so much fun.
Thank you for having me.
All right, and thank you everybody for listening. And we will definitely have show notes, and we will have links to Josh's stuff in the show notes, including a paper that he wrote about Moriarty and music for the Parallel Case blog. So that itself is a fascinating read. So yeah, until next time. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Dynamics of a Podcast was created by Madeline Quinones, with sound design and editing by Dixie Parkinson, and music by Joshua Harvey. We do this podcast purely for the fun of the thing. Thank you for listening, and please join us next time. What is a devil's interval? What is that?
What is the devil's interval?
Mhm.
So it's right. So scales can be like in a Western. I'm talking Western scales, like on a piano, like Western instruments. Because when we get into Indian classical music, Chinese opera, like scales are totally constructed differently
Mhm.
and have more notes very often, right? So a scale can be constructed like a major scale or a minor scale, like that we're used to.
Mhm.
Sound of music, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do.
Mhm.
Minor scale, there are variations, or they can be chromatic. The easiest way to think about what a chromatic scale is if you play every single note on a piano in order
Mm.
to black key. So if I'm playing, like right now, I'm playing a C, and then I'm playing the octave above, which is 8 notes of the scale up. It's the same note. We hear it's the same note. It's just the same note, an octave higher. If I go up the chromatic scale, halfway between those two notes. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 chromatic notes, black to white keys on the piano.
Mm.
It mathematically splits the octave
Mm.
in literal half, sonically. But it's not from a major scale and it's not from a minor scale, and most people don't find it to be particularly appealing. Right? It feels like a dissonant note. Whereas the note above it is what Pythagoras would have called a perfect fifth. It's got a perfect ratio. I don't remember what it is. It's like 2/3 of an octave or 3/5 or so, right? Like, but it's that's a constant interval. It's stable. It's like very stable. If I make a minor chord out of it, then it still stays stable. The perfect fifth actually stays the same for a major. So if I make it major, the bottom note and the top note are still the same. They're stable. If I suddenly do this, it just sort of ratchets everything out of tonality. But what's great about the tritone, the devil's interval, is that it actually drives most harmonic movement. So like the weirdest notes in the scale, essentially the chromatic scale, when I put them with other notes, if I do this, it doesn't sound like much, but if I like put a different bass note to it, maybe, let's see, then suddenly I got this really cool jazzy progression because those notes in our ears, the tritone essentially what it forces our ears to hear the next note. So if I do one of the notes wants to go up and one of the notes wants to go down for our ears. It's just something that we hear as humans. And so it actually drives chords moving to other chords because it's almost like the most unstable of the intervals. It helps us to resolve from keys, essentially.
Mm.
But isolated in and of itself.
So why is it called the devil's interval, though?
Oh, why is it called the devil's interval? Because allegedly, again, those scholars, I've seen YouTube videos recently, like in the past year,
Mhm.
that people are like, this is hogwash. This is something that someone said in some music theory class 100 years ago, and people keep repeating it. Is that it was too dissonant for monks to sing in the Catholic Church because it doesn't sound appealing. Whereas that's cool, that's cool, that's cool, that's cool, that's cool, right? Like almost all of the other ones, this one's not as cool because it's super dissonant. Not usually used as much, but still okay. But as the lore goes, still okay that the Catholic Church is like, you may write Gregorian chant or polyphonic motets of Lassus in sort of certain harmonies, but you may not use the devil's interval because it's too dissonant for church use. I don't want to say necessarily they literally thought it was demonic or if it just got that name, but again, I'm of the camp of the sort of the new scholars that think that maybe some musical, like some music history musicologist person at some point in the last 150 years said it's the devil's interval. The Catholic Church never used it. And it's like, well, they go back and they go through motets and they find a tritone, devil's interval. But generally, it's not. It's also really hard. One of the other reasons it's really hard for singers to hear. If I sing, because it's two notes that are the farthest away and they're not consonant, it's very hard. And
Mhm.
I teach singers literally every day. It's really hard for people to hear. Like neuroscientifically, it's just like weird. It's a weird interval. If somebody gives you a note and they're like, sing a tritone, it's like, I'm old enough now and have enough practice, but most people want to sing any other note beside that. So
Mhm.
composers tried not to write that sort of. But I mean, there are plenty of Bach songs for church where the singer goes, and it makes total sense to the ear, but on the paper it looks really messy very often. So
Mhm.
there are various reasons I think people call it the devil's interval.